So today we're going to talk about post-war America. Just like after World War I, we find we're in a period of great prosperity in America right after World War II. A moment of growth, explosion of the economy, and well-being for the majority of Americans. I'm going to talk about this period, which is basically concentrated on the 1950s, leaving out two of the major aspects of this period, the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement, because we've already addressed the Cold War specifically, and the book talks about the Civil Rights Movement in a later chapter after Kennedy, when the Civil Rights Movement actually comes to its climax. So they go back into the 1950s and they take the whole Civil Rights Movement as one argument. And so we'll look specifically at that later. But for today, we're going to look at the other aspects of these important years in American history. The 1950s, Winston Churchill said that after World War II, America at this moment stands at the summit of the world. And essentially what he was meaning is that America rose out of the ashes of World War II as the greatest, most powerful nation in the world. And why was this? Because of the huge economic development that took place in the United States during the war to provide all of the material for the war for all of the Allied forces, and the fact that America had not suffered the same destruction that most of the other countries had suffered in the war. So the Soviet Union had suffered tremendous losses with the invasion of the Nazis. All of the Allied powers, especially France, had been completely obliterated. Italy had suffered tremendously on both sides when they were on both sides of the war, both from the Allied invasion and from the German oppression after they switched sides. All of these countries, as we had mentioned before at the end of World War II, all of these countries had been fought over more than once. If you think of Great Britain and Germany alone, how many times they had been bombed. This is smithereens, their cities, their industry, their infrastructure. Not even to mention Japan and the suffering that Japan and China went through, and the Philippines and all of the island nations in the Pacific. So these countries had been physically fought over, bombed, obliterated, wiped out. Not only did they lose their young men on the battlefield, but they lost millions of civilians, and they lost their industry, they lost their infrastructure. None of this happened to the United States. The United States lost their young men, and in great number in the war. And we had lost also a lot of material goods in the war, the consummation of material goods. But we did not suffer directly attacks on our own soil, apart from a few minor things on the coast of California and the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, and of course the bombing of Pearl Harbor, etc. Remember though, Alaska and Hawaii at the time were still territories of the United States. They weren't states even yet. But America as a whole, the continental United States, our major cities, our industry, our infrastructure had not suffered in the war. Matter of fact, on the contrary, we had built up even more a huge and mighty infrastructure and industry that powered the rest of the world. So the war for American industry and the American economy was a stimulus. It's actually what helped to bring the United States out of the Great Depression, if you remember correctly. So now, entering into the 1950s, America is booming. The men have come back from the war, and this is a moment in which the American industry is transferring all of its energies and all of its power into now the civilian sector. They've left the military sector as their prominent object of production, and they've moved to the civilian sector to producing consumer goods and helping the consumer economy grow. And so the 1950s are an era of incredible prosperity for the majority of Americans. Both the poor and the middle class rise up. The middle class increases in strength and number, and even the lower portion of the population has gotten to a point where their level of lifestyle has gone up significantly. So in general, we're talking about a period of great prosperity. It's also a period of conflict, because you have to remember that we are in the middle of the Cold War at this time in history, and we're not talking about today the civil rights movement, but obviously this is a source of conflict as well. So those things have to be taken into consideration. But in general, we're looking at a moment of great growth and prosperity. So I mentioned the boom, right? So you have all these men coming back from war, and you have a bright new future on the horizon. So people have babies, and there's a huge baby boom, right? With that sense of security and the promise of the future, people feel that they can have larger families. And we have, by the time this huge baby boom starts to taper off, in the 1960s, we have the birth of about 77 million, what they call baby boomers. And this obviously also helps to stimulate the economy. When you have a negative birth rate, your economy is inevitably going to fall apart. When you have a boom like this, it's obviously going to have to be stimulated because products are necessary. And so this brings on what we call the golden age of American capitalism. We're no longer talking about the Gilded Age. Remember when we talked about the Gilded Age, something that's gilded is covered in gold, but inside it's not gold at all. It's just on the outside. It's just shiny and bright on the outside, but on the inside it could be dark and rotting. In the Golden Age, we're saying, no, it really is gold. It's not just gilded, it's not just gold covered, it really is gold. And in fact, the Golden Age of capitalism, we saw the greatest increase in overall wealth for all Americans. You can see the graph that I actually put on this page here, and it tells us the real family income growth by quintile from 1947 to 73. And then it shows the comparison with the years of 1979 to 2009. Right? So this shows the growth even of the poorest level of the population, so that would be the lowest fifth. We notice that actually the lowest fifth of the population has the highest growth in family income, even more than the highest fifth. So everybody grows in income, but the most growth is seen in actually the lowest fifth of the population. So that's really encouraging for an economy to see this kind of growth from the poorer levels of society to the creation and the strengthening of a very strong middle class. So the middle class is what emerges at this time in the golden age of American capitalism. And consumer goods obviously are produced in great quantities because of the shift in industry, and they're in great demand because we have this baby boom, and we have rates of unemployment have gone down and inflation is kept low. Immediately after the war, from 45 to 50, there was a period of assessment after the war. So you did see in America a period immediately after the war that Truman had to work out where the inflation was going up, etc. It was a moment of adjustment, but almost right away things fell into place and the economy adjusted to a peacetime economy, and unemployment was low, wages were high, they raised the minimum wage, and Social Security was extended. But Eisenhower, who came in after Truman, was a Republican, and he was very much a conservative. So he reversed a lot of the things that had been put in place by FDR with the New Deal, and he supported a dynamic conservatism, is what he called it, where he, on the economic scale, wanted very much to limit the control of the government on the economy and allow a free economy. He also wanted to cut government spending, so cut a lot of those programs that FDR had put in place. And therefore, because of cutting government spending, he was also able to cut taxes on the common person. So this obviously stimulates the economy. And he balanced this dynamic economic conservatism with what he called limited activism. So certain actions done by the government within the power of the government given by the Constitution. One of his major efforts was to connect the United States by an interstate highway system, which ended up costing many billions of dollars, but justified by the fact that the federal government was able to make roads under the Constitution. And he also established the St. Lawrence Seaway, which was a system of locks that connected the Great Lakes with the Atlantic Ocean. So this also permitted new ways of transportation and the ability to get all sorts of natural resources that are found in the Great Lakes area, mostly mining, to get these products out to the Atlantic Ocean and therefore international trade in a much cheaper manner. So all of these things contributed to this economic boom at the time. And probably one of the most important contributions of the moment would have been the GI Bill. GI stands for General Issue, and it's the common military man. So we call the common military man the anonymous military man. We call him GI Joe. Right? So Joe is just a common name. And General Issue Joe is the common military man. Now we have the form for the female as well, and we call her GI Jane, right? So the GI Bill was to help all the veterans coming back from the war. Most of these young men had gone off without much experience in industry and work, or they had not had the opportunity to go to university to get their degrees. They had been shipped right off to war. Maybe when they were 18, 19 years old. So now when they came back after the war, this gave them the opportunity to get back on their feet, to start up their own businesses, to buy homes with reasonable mortgages, and if they so desired, to be able to go to school, attend college, and get a degree so that they could get a better job to help their families. So this GI Bill really did help a large portion of the population to get back on their feet and adjust after the war. So I've put in some publicity here up in the corner, the GI Bill, the New Deal for the veterans, and on the other side, of course, I put a publicity of the golden age of American capitalism. Everybody has a nice new Dodge car because obviously my last name is Dodge, so I always try to get it in there whenever I can. And then if you have a big boom in industry, in consumer goods, in families, large families, many children, you need space. You need space to live, right? And so this is the beginning of the era of the suburbs. People want to escape the crime and the congestion of the cities. With this huge boom in family life, they want more space. They want safe places to raise their family, both with regard to crime, but also with regard to pollution, congestion, dirtiness, etc. of the cities. It's okay to work in an office building in the city or in a factory, but I want my family to be safe and in a beautiful neighborhood where there's trees and flowers and space for my children to play in the backyard. And American industry had slowly found a way of creating products through mass production, assembly line methods, right? And so they had created these methods of creating products quickly, efficiently, and using machinery, less labor. Now they came up with this idea to do the same thing with homes. And William Levitt is well known to have created some of the first neighborhoods of suburbs. And you can see this image of, thousands of miles of tiny little homes, all one next to the other, in a neighborhood plan. And these places were extended territories of little homes that were very much like the other. They could be made almost in an assembly line fashion in a mass production, using mass production techniques, and therefore they could be built very quickly and very cheaply. This allowed for young families who did not have a lot of money to be able to go right outside the city, buy a nice home for their families cheaply, have a beautiful neighborhood with lots of other children and lots of other families, so a beautiful social life. And the increase in the infrastructure and the building of the highway systems, etc., permitted that the fathers of the home would be able to go to work every day in the cities without much difficulties. Of course, this created our beautiful traffic problem in the rush hour, but in the 1950s it wasn't so bad. Also, the GI Bill helped in this case because they allowed for veterans to get low-cost mortgages so they could buy these homes. And it was much easier to get a home in the suburbs than it was to get an apartment in the city. Much cheaper and much safer and much cleaner. So we see a huge boom in private homeownership in the 1950s. It goes from 41% to 61% in this time period. So this is a really important thing because having one's own personal home is a very important aspect in the American mentality. And this period, it was made possible by this mass production technique and the opportunities given to the veterans, and this really allowed for a boom in the suburb lifestyle. Now, during the 1950s, women now start to leave the workforce because the men are coming back from the war and taking back their jobs in the factories and on the farms. And so women return, for the most part, to the home. And this idea that a woman's place is in the home and should be a good wife and a good mother, and her main job, if you will, would be to bear and rear children, especially now when we're talking about the baby boom. This was the mentality that was encouraged in the 1950s. This was the ideal for the American woman. And this was supported in publicity and movies and books, etc. It was encouraged. Unfortunately, sometimes this became suffocating to women, especially those women who had already had an experience in the workforce and had been able to prove themselves as capable of doing more than just the housework and laundry. And it created a certain mentality of what we call here dissatisfaction, and women in general had the sense that they could have a more fulfilling life being in the workforce and at home, but that they should not be just confined to housework and being a good wife and mother. It created kind of this friction in American society at this time, and we see here the seeds of the future feminist movement of the 1960s, where women were once again relegated to the home and confined to a certain mentality of limitation. They had been out in the workforce in World War I. They had brought home a lot of the salaries, the family salaries during the Great Depression, because men couldn't find jobs as easily as women could. And they had also been on the forefront of the workforce during World War II. Now they were coming back home, but they weren't always satisfied with this image of themselves. So what's happening in the business world at this moment? We see a huge shift with the growth of business and less government intervention and free enterprise, we see a huge shift from blue-collar workers to white-collar workers. With the advancements in industry and mechanization of farms and factories, fewer workers are needed to make the same number of products. But at the same time, more jobs are created behind the desk, if you will. So men who would go to work with a white shirt and a tie, and they would work in an office building, were called white-collar workers. Whereas men who worked in factories or on farms and they wore almost like a blue jean kind of shirt that was heavier were called blue-collar workers. And so there's now, in 1956, we have the first time in American history where white-collar workers actually outnumber blue-collar workers. And so we see a shift in society, the type of work that is available. Other big things that happen in business at this time are the creation of large corporations and then the expansion of these large corporations overseas on a multinational level. I've put here a photo of the Seven Sisters. These are probably one of the most important examples of multinational companies. These are the 7 major companies that run and they basically own all of the oil and the oil distribution in the world. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Gulf, BP, Shell, and Texaco. Right? And over time, those 7 sisters, as they call them, changed, but this was their major boom moment of world control of all petroleum products. And so these multinational companies would extend themselves overseas looking for cheap raw materials and also cheap labor, because in other countries they could pay wages at a much lower level than in the United States, for example. And so they would get the cheap raw materials and the cheap labor, and then they would import these materials or even the finished products to the market in the United States. And this became the new multinational corporations. Franchises also were a big thing in the 1950s. They started booming all over the United States. And a franchise is when one person owns one or more of the businesses of a larger chain. So the first thing that comes to mind are fast food businesses. So one of the first ones was McDonald's, obviously. And so one person owns a McDonald's or maybe 2 or 3 McDonald's in the city. And to be able to be part of the McDonald's family, McDonald's franchise business, the larger chain, you had to have certain standards. You had to follow certain standards of McDonald's, and you had to make all of the food in a certain way and have the same food choices as every other McDonald's and have the same publicity and the same images and the same colors. All right, so, but this guaranteed to customers that wherever they went, at whatever McDonald's they went, they would get the same kind of food, cooked in the same way, and they could rely on its quality. They knew how McDonald's would be everywhere they went. If they went to a McDonald's in New York, or if they went to a McDonald's in San Francisco or in Houston, Texas. And this had its draws for clients. They want dependability and familiarity. And it's not only in the food industry, but also in clothing and other consumer products. So this was a big moment for franchises to emerge on a competitive basis throughout the United States. A quick look at science and technology in the 1950s. Some really important discoveries were made, especially in medicine. If we think about the fact that this was the age of radiation and chemotherapy, right? So for that's for cancer treatments. The polio vaccine. Remember FDR? He could have been saved his paralysis if he had been born a little bit later. But this is the age of the discovery of the polio vaccine. And they had new tests now for blood tests and antibiotics for tuberculosis. So it almost became extinct as a life-threatening disease. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation was invented as a procedure. It's well known as CPR, its acronym, which is basically mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and heart massages for when people have heart attacks and their heart stops. And this was the moment when they did the first open heart surgeries and replaced heart valves with artificial valves, and they put in pacemakers. So a lot of different discoveries in the area of medicine, but also in technology with regard to the computer. This is the age of the computer. The 1950s is when the computer made its debut in the world. The first really well-known computer was called UNIVAC, the Universal Automatic Computer. 1946, there was the ENIAC, which was the real first computer type machine, but the more well-known real first computer that is the father of all computers is the UNIVAC, and I have a picture of the UNIVAC up in the corner. You see the two men working in the room. That whole room is the computer. So, we think of our tiny little, cell phones that basically have the power of a computer, and in the 1950s, this was the first computer, and it takes up a whole room, and more than one person has to work on it at a time. So it was quite a complex system. Another really important thing that happened at this time was the transatlantic cable. They laid a new transatlantic cable between Europe and the United States to improve telecommunication between the continents. This was a huge work. And advances in aviation, especially the jet propulsion, allowed for cheap and quick air travel. So it became a method of transportation much more reliable and affordable for the average American, which is really important because America is one country, but it's very large. So traveling from one part of the country to another was very expensive and took a long time. Now with aviation making these advancements, it was much more possible for a family to be able to travel from one part of the country to the other. Another two important inventions of the time that really changed day-to-day life was the transistor, which is an electronic device that allowed for television sets, computers, radios, and hearing aids, all of these things to operate as mobile devices. So allowing for radios to be installed in cars, for example. And television also made great steps at this moment in becoming television in color. So color came into the television sets in this period, although we don't usually see color televisions in the living rooms of common Americans yet because they're more expensive. But it does revolutionize the movie theater because of color televisions. The use of movies in movie-going is very much affected. And we have magnetic tape that is now used to build a tape programs. So this changes television as well, because before all the shows were aired live. Now they're actually able to tape the programs and then show them at another time or re-show them more than once. So this is really important for their abilities to change television as a means of communication. And then in 1957, we have the space age, which is born with the Soviets who launch Sputnik, the satellite that orbits the Earth for the first time. So we see in the 1950s, the computer age is born and the space age is born at the same time. But probably the 1950s is most well known for the pop culture that grew out of this period. So, as I was mentioning, the fact that color televisions and just televisions in general were much more common in family homes because they were more affordable, this made movie going a lot less popular because they have it in their own living room, And so the movie industry was really big at this time but they had to also draw customers with other methods, including 3D movies that you had to wear special glasses to. The radio industry changed a lot as well, because television took over a lot of the comedies, dramas, and soap operas that had been, done on the radios. Now the television has taken over, so the radios have to kind of change. They have to shift their broadcasting industry to more music, news, and weather, talk shows, etc. So radio doesn't go down; it just changes its focus. And one of the big focuses of radio now becomes the car, because Americans in their own home can watch the television. They don't have to listen to the radio anymore. But when they're in their car, they have no other choice. And people, now that they're commuting back and forth from the suburbs to the cities where they work, have long road trips every day. And so radio becomes important in the American cars. And so there's actually a boom. Even though there's a boom in television, there's a boom in radio as well. And more radio stations are established at this time than ever before. The most well-known part of pop culture in this era is the birth of rock and roll, with our rock and roll king, Elvis Presley. Right? So we have all these big names: Sam Cooke, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Buddy Holly, and this whole rage of music helps the music industry to change a lot, and its focus starts moving towards the young audience. This rock and roll music, as comparison to the early 1950s, when we think of singers like Bill Crosby, etc., who appeal to older audiences, this shift starts to create what they call a generation gap between young people who are listening to their type of music and older, mature people who are listening to a completely different type of music. And this is the first time when we really see this great division between the generations with this rock and roll music. And some of these people become incredible idols to American young people. And when the musicians, the great musicians, Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. Richardson die in an airplane crash, this is a very pivotal moment for young Americans. And it is immortalized in the song American Pie by Don McLean, and when he calls it the day the music died. So this is like a very important event for the young pop culture in America. And that brings us to the end. I've put here for you guys to watch a short video. I think it's like 10 minutes. It's kind of creative and it's cute. I think you'll get a kick out of it. It's actually a documentary that's been done by, it looks like kids in the middle school, high school age group. And so it's been done actually really well. It's very accurate. And so you can listen to it and know that what's being said is correct, but it's also been done in a very comical way. So I think you'll enjoy it. It's a good 10 minutes well spent. So I will see you later for the next chapter on the New Frontier and the Great Society. Goodbye, my dears.